The global economy is unraveling at an alarming pace. In the heart of Europe, powers like Germany and Austria are faltering, while conflict-ridden nations such as Yemen and Sudan are experiencing unprecedented collapses. But what lies behind these numbers? These are not mere statistics, but the reflection of a system that is cracking, a struggle for power, geopolitics, and inequalities that drag millions down. In this video, we will unpack the economic crisis of 12 sinking countries, not from the perspective of the mainstream media, but through a critical, academic, and historical lens. We will discover how oil, debt, and war are not accidents, but tools of a capitalism that feeds on misery. Stay until the end, because what happens in these places is not separate from us. It is the mirror of a future that is already here.
South Sudan.
The deep economic contraction of South Sudan, minus 4.3% according to the IMF and minus 30% according to the World Bank, is not a simple market failure, but the stark manifestation of accumulation by dispossession. From a Marxist perspective, the disruption of oil production, which causes a loss of $7 million per day, not only affects public finances, but also dismantles the livelihoods of the population. Hyperinflation and food insecurity affecting 80% of inhabitants are tools of economic warfare that expropriate the purchasing power of workers and peasants. Sociologically, the armed conflict perpetuates a social fracture where elites become wealthy from oil revenues and aid, while the majority are forced into subsistence economies. In international relations, South Sudan is a pawn on a geopolitical board where regional and global powers use war to control resources and maintain a state of chronic dependency.
Equatorial Guinea. The projected GDP contraction of Equatorial Guinea, minus 4.2%, is the result of the resource curse, taken to its extreme. Heavy dependence on oil has consolidated a rentier regime that, from a Marxist viewpoint, appropriates surplus value without creating productive value. This fosters corruption and obscene social inequality, where a small elite lives in opulence, while the majority lack basic services. From an anthropological perspective, the lack of data and international transparency is not accidental. It is a control mechanism that allows the elite to govern without accountability, hiding exploitation and misery. This clientelist system keeps the population in absolute dependence, dismantling any form of autonomous social organization.
Venezuela. Venezuela's GDP contraction of negative 4.0% in 2025 represents the culmination of a systemic collapse that goes beyond oil price volatility. The current crisis is the expression of a profound class struggle and a geopolitical confrontation where sanctions imposed by foreign powers, mainly the US, act as a form of economic warfare aiming to reconfigure power in favor of transnational capital. From a Marxist analysis, hyperinflation and the collapse of oil production are consequences of an extractive system that, unable to reproduce society's material conditions, falls into a spiral of disintegration. The crisis is not only economic, but also cultural and social, with a mass exodus that fragments communities and disarticulates solidarity networks, weakening the working class's capacity to organize and resist capital's offensive.
Haiti. Haiti's 2.2% GDP contraction in 2025, directly linked to political uncertainty and gang violence, reflects a society destructured by foreign intervention and the weakness of a state captured by local elites and neo-colonial interests. Armed gangs are not external actors, but the manifestation of a struggle for territorial control and capital flows that appropriate the profits of humanitarian aid, informal trade, and commodity trafficking. From an anthropological perspective, the crisis shows the breakdown of social fabric and the stripping away of communal ties. Everyday life has been commodified, and survival has become a commodity in an informal market. The collapse of the state is the result of a long history of forced indebtedness, military invasions, and the imposition of neoliberal policies that have deprived the population of their livelihoods and capacity for self-determination.
Yemen.
Yemen's real GDP contraction of 1.5% in 2025, accompanied by a 19% drop in GDP per capita, reveals the devastating nature of a conflict that is both a civil war and a geopolitical battleground. The blockade of oil exports by Houthi forces is not only an act of war, but a strategy to control capital flows and deprive the state of its revenues, subjecting the population to a logic of subsistence and dependence on external aid. From an international relations perspective, the conflict is a proxy war in which regional and global powers, such as Saudi Arabia and Iran, use local factions to maintain influence and control strategic trade routes. The market fragments, and parallel economies are imposed, one based on inflation and another on barter, which dismantles any possibility of a unified national economy and turns the population into victims of a power struggle they do not control.
Iraq. The projected real GDP contraction of 1.5% for Iraq in 2025, despite being a major oil exporter, illustrates the trap that countries with an extractive accumulation model fall into. Contrary to what one might expect from a booming oil market, political instability and institutional corruption prevent oil wealth from translating into sustainable development. From a Marxist standpoint, the problem is that oil capital is an enclave that does not integrate with the rest of the economy, but generates a parallel economy of rents and corruption that benefits a political and military elite. Oil revenues are not invested in building an industrial fabric or public services, but are distributed among elites, perpetuating an accumulation system with no productive vocation. Instead of benefiting from oil wealth, the population suffers the consequences of a weak and dysfunctional state.
Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico's 0.8% GDP contraction in 2025 is the result of a colonial status that has subordinated the island's economy and politics to the interests of the U.S. metropolis. The prolonged fiscal crisis and enormous public debt are not accidents, but the consequence of a system that has allowed U.S. financial elites to expropriate the island's wealth through debt mechanisms. From an anthropological perspective, massive emigration is a form of demographic dispossession that weakens social networks and society's capacity to resist. Natural disasters, like hurricanes, act as catalysts that expose the fragility of a system not designed to protect the population, but to facilitate capital accumulation. The island's lack of sovereignty prevents the implementation of economic policies that would benefit the local population, leaving it at the mercy of Washington's political decisions and big capital's interests.
Sudan. The projected 0.4% GDP contraction for Sudan in 2025, combined with 100% hyperinflation, is evidence of a civil war that is not only armed conflict, but a class struggle over control of the state and resources. The conflict has dismantled production structures and imposed a militarized accumulation regime, where the population's survival is subordinated to the logic of war. From a Marxist perspective, hyperinflation is a mechanism to expropriate workers' wealth, who see their wages and savings lose value, while capital finds refuge in financial assets and essential goods. The conflict disarticulates the working classes and peasantry, preventing their organization and resistance capacity, while financial and military capital benefit from destruction and chaos.
Botswana. The 0.4% GDP contraction in 2025 exposes not only the fragility of an economy based almost exclusively on diamonds, but also the deeply unequal nature of its social structure. From an anthropological view, this enclave economy has reproduced colonial patterns. While a political business elite tied to the diamond trade concentrates wealth, large rural and urban sectors remain marginalized with little access to basic services and decent employment. From a Marxist perspective, Botswana demonstrates how natural resource extraction continues to serve global capital accumulation rather than internal development. Diamond rents, far from transforming relations of production, keep the country as a peripheral supplier in the international division of labor, without changing the dependent character of its economy. The anarchist approach questions the country's apparent stability. A state structure that preserves the order necessary for diamond extraction and export, but inhibits any radical transformation that would empower local communities.
Social peace is sustained by passive acceptance of subordination to transnational capital. Finally, from an international relations standpoint, Botswana does not act as a fully sovereign actor, but as a node in a global network where decisions about prices, trade flows, and financing are dictated by mining cartels, transnational corporations, and international financial centers. Its GDP decline is not an isolated phenomenon, but a symptom of the structural vulnerability of countries whose natural wealth feeds the global capitalist system, without translating into internal social welfare.
Austria. Austria's third consecutive recession, -0.3%, is a symptom of the contradictions of advanced capitalism. The loss of competitiveness in its industrial sector and high energy prices are the result of a crisis of capital profitability. From a Marxist perspective, to recover profits, Austrian capital will seek to increase exploitation of labor through precarization and wage cuts, which will generate greater social polarization. In international relations, Austria's recession is not isolated, but part of a broader crisis of the European economic model, which suffers the consequences of trade tensions and the relocation of production to countries with lower wages. Germany. Germany's economic stagnation, 0.1% or 0.0%, reflects the crisis of its export-oriented capitalism model. Trade tensions with China and the US are not only tariff disputes, but the expression of a struggle for global economic hegemony. From a Marxist perspective, the decline in exports is a symptom of overproduction and a lack of markets for German capital. Sociologically, this stagnation increases labor precarity and fragments the working class. The lack of investment and the structural decline of key industries show that the German bourgeoisie, instead of investing in productive development, seeks refuge in financial speculation, perpetuating crisis and inequality. Italy. Italy's low growth, 0.4%, reflects chronic stagnation. From an international relations perspective, the Italian economy is trapped in a dilemma. On the one hand, its high public debt makes it vulnerable to pressure from financial markets and European institutions, ECB, European Commission, which impose austerity policies that hinder growth. On the other hand, its low productivity and structural rigidities result from family-based capitalism and a lack of investment in innovation. From a Marxist perspective, stagnation is a disciplinary mechanism of capital that uses debt and low productivity as pretexts to impose cuts in social spending and wages, perpetuating inequality and underdevelopment.